which is what's makes it interesting. The life sciences, studies of the life sciences, and I'm going to talk about moving from studies of the life sciences to studies with the life sciences. And I think the word with is useful because it can be used in many different ways, and I'm going to kind of exploit that ambiguity in what I'm going to say. But first I was going to do, which I thought would be so original, and give you the Egenis logo from when I was at Egenis, but unfortunately that has been shown multiple times today, so you're not going to be that impressed by it. But I did arrive at Egenis a long time ago. I arrived in 2002. I think I was the first postdoc to arrive at Egenis, yeah. And this is a website actually from 2006. When I arrived, we were in the Amory building. We just had a cluster of corridors. We didn't move into Burnt House until 2006. And this is, yeah, the website when we moved there. And so this was my first postdoc after my PhD, and I've just count myself as extremely lucky and very surprised, in fact, to have been hired by John Barry Barnes and Steve Hughes. And not surprisingly, as you'll have gathered, I had a fantastic time here. I was employed as a social scientist. This was an ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council grant. So we needed some social scientists. So I was employed as a social scientist working in the field of science and technology studies. But what was really nice is that there are no barriers between the conceptual and the empirical work. And I didn't realize how many titles of things I had, like sociological and philosophical, like in the same title. I was also given the freedom to explore my own ideas, but with the continual intellectual inspiration of Egenis, a great feeling of collegiality and a real sense that academic research can be fun, which I've tried to take with me wherever I go. There was also a feeling of excitement at being at the start of something really special. We were really trying to understand genomes and take seriously the idea of being a centre for genomics in society. And Steve Hughes memorably defined a genome as the space in which genes happen, which I think is great and has never left me. So we were also like delving into the sociological and the philosophical and the sociological and the STS literature. So I actually was employed to work on intellectual property. And I took kind of very seriously John's work on biological ontology, asking how genes and genomes are things that can actually be owned and commodified. And then I got very interested in systems biology as an attempt to overcome the reductionism of molecular biology. And I did work on this with Maureen O'Malley, as you will have seen. And Maureen, I'm so glad she's had such a mention. She was so important in my time in Egenis, and she's, yeah, really influential on my thinking and just such the heart and soul of Egenis as well when I was there. But this led Maureen and I and Alex and John as well in this paper to consider systems biology's sister discipline, which is synthetic biology, which maybe I now regret because my work on that coincided with my move to the University of Edinburgh. And I have basically was one of the few social scientists who actually published on synthetic biology, thanks to the paper with Maureen. And since then, I've been completely engulfed and enrolled in the field of synthetic biology. And this is a situation I'm still in. And to such an extent, I had to write a book about it to try and work out what the hell have I been doing in my life over the last 15 years. So basically, my book is called Place for STS if you're interested in finding out. But one of the things that was kind of so overwhelming about this is that I was invited into the field by the synthetic biologists. They wanted me to be part of their grants. It's quite different from the normal, often mode of integration when you interact with scientific fields. But one of the things I've been thinking about is my orientation towards the field as a social scientist. So I think we can think in terms of studies of the field in a kind of observational sense, studies for the field in a service sense, and studies with the field, and obviously in a collaborative sense. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. And one of my reasons for doing this is because I've become increasingly dissatisfied with the kind of traditional social scientific distance from the object of study, the kind of separation that it often implies. Because I think it can feel extractive to use scientists as people for whom you just go and kind of interview technology away and then write it up for your own purposes and your own peers. Instead of seeing scientists as my informants, I've come to see them as my collaborators, my colleagues, and my epistemic partners. I have become part of their endeavours. I do not just observe them. And I think this relates to some of the things that Adrian said yesterday about the relationships of social science to the objects of study, as I would phrase it, that my relationships are one of interaction and conversation rather than distance observation. And so this leads me to this idea of studies with, and by this I mean interdisciplinary collaboration. And the reason I like to use this picture is because this type of collaboration is often perilous and risky, and I think this represents it quite well. And I'm just going to give you an example of this studies with, which is a project that I was involved in called Synthetic Aesthetics, which brought together synthetic biologists, social scientists, and artists and designers to explore what it means to design with living things. And I'm not going to describe this project in any detail, but just to give you a snapshot, it involved exploring how biology computes using shape and form, looking at synthetic biology from the humbling perspective of geological time, which extends from the beginning to the end of the Earth, asking whether inanimate machines are only an interlude in nature, and making cheese from bacteria that grow on human skin, which I won't go into now, but I'm happy to talk about over lunch. So this was a project that operated between social science, synthetic biology, and art and design. But what for me was most revelatory about it is what we did together. What we created came out of the intersection of our different disciplines, and we could not have done it alone. And so this is studying with, that's interdisciplinary, and it's interdisciplinarity, but it's a particular type of interdisciplinarity. It's one that benefits from the multiplicity and heterogeneity of ways of seeing that different disciplines offer. It's one that values diversity and pluralism, which obviously resonates strongly with John's work. And it's one that expands the imaginations of everyone involved and brings new possibilities to light. So this is all very well in theory, but the problem with studies with is it can shift into studies for, performing the service for a more powerful epistemic, financially, politically powerful group, which is, in my case, synthetic biologists. And so I often am concerned that I have become an example of the domestication of critique in this field. I have concerns about compromise, which is really an issue when you're attached to a highly politicized field like synthetic biology, of complicity, of becoming an accomplice, and of contamination. Although contamination is not necessarily negative, Anna Singh usefully defines it as transformation through encounter. So that's studies with other people, but why stop there? Why not extend studies with to the other organisms? And the reason I'm saying this grows out of my work in synthetic biology, but it's also inspired by John and Maureen's work on life and John's work on the processes of life. So in order to explain this, I have to say a bit about synthetic biology. And this is a field that operates at the intersection of, or tries to bring engineering principles into biology. And something that keeps me interested in the field is that these biological systems, they resist this. And so the hopeful contingencies of biology continually require humility of the engineers. And just because we talked about Lego yesterday, I thought I should throw in my favorite picture of synthetic biology, which is this aspiration to build biological systems from standardized interchangeable parts that we see in the field. But the thing about synthetic biology is it shows that biology continually overflows and exceeds the constraints of engineering, that engineers have to be open to the possibility and potential of the living world, and that they have to work with the systems they engineer and renege on their ambitions for control. And so to give an example of this, I'm just going to talk about the synthetic yeast project that I have studied. This was an attempt to build an entirely synthetic version of the yeast genome of the species Saccharomyces cerevisiae to make it more predictable and amenable to human control. And this was interesting because synthetic biologists, some of them talk about being organism agnostic. They say, I don't care which organism I work on. And this is why they use the metaphor of a chassis, which is a kind of neutral metaphor for the cell where you can just bung your parts into it. But the thing about the yeast project is the scientists were far from organism agnostic. They talked about how much they loved the yeast, how great it was to work with, how manipulable what it was, how much they liked the way it smells. So basically there was a huge amount of affection and appreciation for the yeast. They even talked about preserving the yeastiness of the yeast in its synthetic form. So they were totally enamored by the properties of the organism. So I think this is an example of studying with. This is an example of the scientists working with the yeast to achieve shared goals through mechanisms like directed evolution. But I mean, I'm not going to be overly simplistic about it. Their attitude to the yeast was ambivalent. They killed a lot of yeast. They were simultaneously tools and partners, machines and collaborators. But I think this is a nice example of studying with between the human and non-human world. But we can extend this further, of course. John and Maureen have written about how collaboration should be seen as a central characteristic of living matter, and how life is a continuum of variably structured collaborative systems, all the way from viruses to ecosystems, with everything in between. And then my understanding of John's process philosophy is that this leads us to challenge a sharp distinction between life and non-life. As this paper says, when something is collaborating, it's living. So even chemical and physical systems may be considered living at some times. And this means that maybe we should consider studying with things that may sometimes be considered the non-living. So we should extend the idea of studying with even more broadly than studying with the living, because maybe it is collaboration all the way down. And this obviously has implications for our relationship to our changing planet, because if we are fundamentally interconnected and dependent on the living and non-living world, that changes our orientation to this world. So just to conclude, I've argued that we should not engage in distance observation either of other people or of the non-human world. Instead, we should open ourselves up to the hopeful contingencies and to the potential of being transformed through our encounters with them. And in terms of prospects, I think if we think of prospects for interdisciplinary studies with the life sciences, this can be a valuable avenue to explore as we enter an uncertain future.